Well, we're gathering back today to once again look at the book of Ecclesiastes. I had finished the first two chapters, and a lot of the first two chapters were almost like despair, where Solomon was examining life from various aspects. He looked at it from wisdom standpoint, from folly, from working hard and toil and trying to accomplish things. And the end he came up with was it's all vanity. It's fleeting, and it does not satisfy. And toward the end there, he talked about toil because he had done a lot of work. He said that the one who works hard, in the end, leaves it to someone else because he's going to die. And who knows if they'll be wise or not? Who knows if they will keep what he has built? And he said this is vanity. And the idea of toil that he has here is someone who's really working hard to get ahead, someone who wants to do something and accomplish something, and they're working so hard. This is their sole focus, because he talks about being vexed. And you know, there are people, they may be rich or they may be poor, but they're so focused upon what they're doing in this life that they lay awake at night and they worry about it. And that is the symbolism that Solomon uses. But then at the end of that chapter, he gives a way out. He said, I know nothing better than a man should enjoy his toil, for that is his gift from God. So he brings in the sovereignty of God, that God has given mankind work. He has given us the things that we have, and we should enjoy them. And this is against the idea of working for work's sake, or wisdom for wisdom's sake, or folly for folly's sake. But recognizing that what we have is a gift from God. It is controlled by God. It is under God's sovereign authority, and He's given it to us to enjoy, because our time on this earth is limited. Now, once again, I want to remind you, Solomon is not talking about eternal destiny here. He does consider these things, and he does talk about these things, and we will see it in this lesson today. But his focus is life, living life on this earth which is fallen, this earth which has things that are not good in it, and things that don't satisfy, which he has abundantly told us. So he says the way around this is to enjoy what God has given. See it as a gift from God. Enjoy it for the time that God has given us. And so that brings us this thought of life under God's sovereign control and enjoying life under God's control is what takes us to chapter 3. And it's a very familiar passage. It begins with, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Now that's a very famous passage. It was a famous song by the Byrds back in the 1960s for some of you who are older. Some of you may be saying, who were the Byrds? The B-Y-R-D-S. But this is a famous passage. And so he says, for everything there's a season and a time for every matter. Now, he's not just throwing something out of random time. The idea is, under God's control, there's a season and a time for everything. And we do really need to understand that as people of God. Our lives will have different times and seasons. And those of us who have lived a few years and have had the opportunity to reflect upon this would say, yes, that's absolutely true. Our lives have seasons. We have seasons where we do these things. We may have seasons of difficulty. We may have seasons of regrowth. We may have seasons of other things. We may have a season in which we do certain things. And then other seasons when those things go aside and we do something else. So let's look at what Solomon teaches on this. He says, repeat it once again, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Verse 2, he says, a time to be born and a time to die. Now that's something he has hinted at. That the great equalizer in life is that everybody dies. And that's something that wise people live with an understanding of. There are a lot of people in this world that live as if they're never going to die. They don't think about what they're building. They just think about what they're enjoying or what they're experiencing. So the understanding of there is a time to be born. We are all of us that live have been born. And one thing that's certain, all of us who are living will die. That is the fundamental truth of human existence. Death is part of life because of the fall, because of Adam's sin. It was not originally part of that, but Adam's sin. And that's the world we have inherited. It's a world in which we are born and which we are die. So we have to live with the understanding of that. Solomon says if you're focused upon what you're doing and you're focused upon things in this life and just getting things, the fact of death will be despair to you because you will leave it all and you can't take it with you. And so, but once again, he talked that those who understand enjoy the life they have while they have it. So there is a time to be born and a time to die. We have to understand that. And we have to make preparations for that, not only for the eternal aspects of that, but how we're going to live while we're here. And so then he says also in that same second verse, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. This is probably a reference to harvest time and planting. It certainly is an agricultural reference. There's a time to plant. There's a time to pluck up what you've planted. There's a time to put things in the ground. There's a time to take things out of the ground. This is common understanding. And it's also a metaphor that there are different parts of life that he's really going to develop more as he goes down this list. Verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal. Now, when he says this, he's not saying that, okay, you're going to have a time in your life when you can kill and then other times when you can heal. No, these times are not under our control. But we do know that life has things that are killing and things that are healing. There are times of war, which he will mention a little later. There are times when violence happens. We see it around us every day. And so we do see the time to kill going on around us and also times to heal. But he says these are all going to be a part of life, a time to kill and a time to heal. Verse 3 also, a time to verse 3, a time to break down and a time to build up. Build up is the image of building something. And in the life of Israel, you saw this breaking down and building up a lot. In Solomon's day, there was a lot of building up. Solomon built things. In later kings, where they came into power, they were godly kings, and the previous king had been wicked and had set up idolatry and set up houses of wickedness. They broke those down. There was one king which it said he broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes. Certainly that was something to be broken down. So there is a time to build up. And there are things that need to be built up. And there are things that need to be torn down. And we could say that just as much in our day as in the day of Solomon. So then he says in verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh. We have those seasons. We have those seasons of sadness and sorrow that bring weeping. We have the seasons of happiness and joy that bring laughter. And so life is managing these things. And life is understanding that these times are going to come. We have to deal with the times of weeping, and we need to cherish and enjoy the times of laughter, the times of happiness. He says in verse 4 again, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Once again, two extremes. Mourning is similar to weeping, that people mourn when there is sorrow, and especially mourning is usually associated with death. Sometimes mourning is associated with sin for the godly person. But then there's a time to dance. A dance is the symbol of happiness. I know some Baptists would not think about that, but that's a joke. But dancing is the sign of joy. So very parallel in this. There are going to be these times in life. Times of mourning. Times to dance. Verse 5. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. Now this is a little enigmatic. Some of the commentators think that this has to do maybe with the idea of gathering stones would be like to clear a ground. Maybe to clear a ground for planting, or clear a ground for a ruler to come through, a conqueror. And to cast away stones may be like putting stones on the ground. One of the things that they would do when they conquered somebody, that nations would do, is they would throw a lot of stones on the ground so that they couldn't plant. Or at least they had to clean up the stones before they planted. So that may be the imagery, but the idea is, once again, there's a time for things. There's a time in a different season for these opposite things. Verse 5, the second part of that, it says a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And he's going to have other things that's going to talk about this, but the idea is there's a time to love and there's a time to embrace. But then there is a time that that there's not going to be embracing. Maybe there's a separation. Maybe there's something that has happened that necessitates a separation. There's a lot of things you can pour into this, but he's just saying there's a time for all things. He says in verse 6, a time to seek and a time to lose. There is a time to go after things. Sometimes there's a time to let some things go. And I think we understand that in our lives. Sometimes when we're younger, we don't understand that. We really understand the seeking, but we don't understand so much the letting go. But as we get older, we realize, yeah, you got to let some things go. Sadly, sometimes you have to let some people go, because for whatever reason, they no longer can be a part of your life. And that's sad. And he says in verse 7, a time to tear and a time to sow. It's very similar to the idea of building up and breaking down. We think of tearing a garment, and we think of resewing that garment, in that kind of attitude. There's a time to rip things up, and there's a time to sew things back together. And we do need to understand that sometimes life demands a breaking down or a tearing, because there are things that need to be torn. There are things that need to be broken down. And these are all under the direction of God, and wise people understand that. But then there's also a time to build up, and there's a time to heal. There's a time to sow. There's a time to heal the breaches. And so these times come from the Lord. He says, a time to keep silent and a time to speak. This is also in verse 7. A time to keep silent and a time to speak. That's something we have sometimes a hard time learning. We're pretty good at speaking, but we're also not always good about being silent. So there is a time to keep our mouths shut. There is a time to listen. There's a time to learn. But then there's a time to speak. There's a time to stand up. There's a time to speak what needs to be spoken. Maybe there's a time to teach what needs to be taught. So we need to understand that these times are going to come, and we need to live in these times. He says in verse 8, the last verse of this cycle of times, he says, a time to love and a time to hate. Now these love and hate are two very extreme emotions. And we think, well, why would we ever want to hate? Well, the Bible talks about hating. It says, I hate every evil way. David wrote about those who hate God. He said, I hate them. And so God talks about things his soul hates, things that are not of God. So there is a time for hatred, and there's a time for love. We should be loving to people. We should be loving in ways that we can be loving. We should have a heart of love toward everyone. Jesus said, love your enemies. And so the idea of hating is not contradicting what Jesus has said. It's just acknowledging that there are things that deserve our loathing. There are things that we should despise, and those are every wicked way. And the wickedness that some people do, we should hate. Now, our world is filled with wickedness, and Solomon's world was filled with wickedness, so nothing has really changed in that regard. Sometimes people say, well, it's worse than it's ever been. Well, not necessarily. Actually, sometimes some things today are better than it has been in the past. Certainly Solomon's day was a wicked day, especially outside the boundaries of Israel, in which wickedness was abounding and brutality and murder. And so there are things we should hate, even in this day in which we live. But there's also a time for love. And then the last thing he says, a time for war and a time for peace. Also in that verse 8, a time for war and a time for peace. There are times that we must go to war. As a nation, sometimes. Sometimes there are times we must go to war personally for some things going on, maybe in our area or our church or whatever. There is a time for war, because some things cannot be just healed, they must be opposed. But then he says there's a time for peace. And peace is so important. Peace is given to us by God. It is the absence of conflict. It is well-being, really. In the Hebrew sense, shalom means well-being. So it means more than just the absence of conflict. It means good times, good things. So I'm going to stop after we finish this part because it's taken a while to do that, and we'll continue later. But I want us to see here, and the summation I want us to see, and to go back to the end of chapter 2 where Solomon was talking about there are things that will bring you to despair, but enjoy the life God has given you, the toil, the life. It's all a gift from Him. And then chapter 3, He controls the times. He controls all the circumstances. All of these times we went over, these are under the control of God. And so once again, understand that. Live in honor and glory to God in all of the times that we find ourselves. And then when we go further in this, He's going to give us a little more understanding of the times and God's control of the times and how we should understand that. And we will look at that on the next time. So thank you for joining me. God bless you.